Catherine Sterling fired a single father in front of 300 employees and refused to give him a real reason. He said nothing. He set his badge on the table and walked out. 3 minutes later, 10 black SUVs surrounded the building. Men in dark suits lined up in front of him. A powerful woman stepped out and bowed her head. "Commander Cole," she said, "we have been waiting 12 years." Catherine had no idea who she had just destroyed. At 6:12 in the morning, Chicago was still half asleep, but Xavier Cole was already walking through the doors of Sterling Dynamics the same way he had for the past 6 years. He wore the same white shirt, the same gray tie, and the same scratched old watch that had clearly seen better decades. He had no assistant waiting for him, no private office, and no one greeting him in the lobby. On the company system, he was listed simply as Senior Operations Manager, earning $128,000 a year. A decent salary for an ordinary man, but a rounding error inside an $18 billion empire. The younger employees called him too quiet behind his back, and a few of them mocked the beat-up 2008 Ford he still drove to work every single day. Xavier never reacted to any of it. He simply did his job, sat in the chair that faced the door, and somehow always knew exactly where every security camera in the building was pointed. There were small details about him that never quite added up. When a false fire alarm sent hundreds of employees into a panic scramble for the exits, Xavier was the only person who stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, checking the ceiling vents and reading the direction of the airflow before moved a single muscle. A coworker once asked him if he had served in the military, and Xavier only smiled and said no, which was not entirely a lie, but it was not entirely the truth either. That particular morning, Xavier discovered a serious problem buried inside Sterling's international shipping system. 17 containers of semiconductor equipment, worth $240 million, were being routed to the wrong destination entirely, and if nobody caught it in time, the company would lose control of the shipment within days. He immediately sent a report to Chief Operating Officer Carter Hayes. There was no response. He sent it a second time, and this time Carter called him directly. His voice sharp and irritated. "Cole, your job is operations, not investigations," Carter snapped. Xavier stayed calm and explained that if those containers reached the port of Savannah by Thursday, Sterling would permanently lose custody of the shipment. Carter went quiet for 2 full seconds before answering coldly, "Forget about it," and hung up. Xavier stared at the screen for a long moment. He was not angry. But for the first time in years, something shifted behind his eyes, and he opened his desk drawer to look at an old black phone with no logo and no ordinary SIM card, before closing the drawer again without a word. There was one more detail nobody in the building had ever noticed. Every evening before leaving, Xavier walked past the loading docks on the ground floor, not because his job required it, but because he wanted to see the trucks with his own eyes. He would count them, check the seals on the containers, and note which drivers seemed nervous and which ones seemed rehearsed. None of this appeared in any job description at Sterling Dynamics, and none of it was ever asked of him. Yet he did it anyway, quietly every single day, the way a man checks the locks on his own house before he goes to sleep at night. 61 floors above him, Carter walked into Catherine's office and dropped Xavier's personnel file on her desk. "This man is digging too deep," he told her. Catherine did not even look up from her screen. "Then fire him," she said. "Today," Carter asked, testing her. Now she answered, already reaching for her pen. Catherine Sterling had become a billionaire at the age of 34, and 5 years later, she controlled a technology empire spanning 27 countries. The financial press had nicknamed her the Ice Queen of American tech, and she did not mind the title at all. She believed a chief executive did not need to be loved, only feared, and that belief had only deepened after her father passed away, and the board of directors quietly assumed she was too young to run the company he built from a single small factory. Within 18 months of taking control, Catherine removed 7 senior executives, and the company's revenue rose by 31%, while its stock price doubled. From that moment forward, she carried one dangerous conviction everywhere she went, that her instincts were always right. Carter understood this about her perfectly, and he never once asked Catherine to fire Xavier directly. Instead, he built a flawless-looking file, 3 procedural violation reports, 2 internal complaints, and 1 accusation of accessing data outside his job description, all of it framed carefully to make Xavier look like a threat to the company Catherine spent exactly 4 minutes reading it before asking whether the man mattered at all, and Carter told her he could be replaced within a week. She signed the termination order without hesitation, but just as Carter turned to leave something in the file, caught her eye a strange gap in Xavier's employment history, stretching back 12 years with no old resume, no prior company listed, and no career trail she could find anywhere. What did he do before Sterling, she asked. Consulting Carter answered a little too quickly, for whom Catherine pressed. Unclear, Carter said. She studied his face for a second, then two, and for one brief moment she almost trusted the discomfort crawling up her spine. But her phone rang with an investor call, and the feeling passed before she could act on it. That was her second mistake of the day. The first had already been signed and sealed on the paper sitting in Carter's hand. Catherine had built her entire leadership philosophy around the idea that hesitation was a form of weakness, and weakness was something she had trained herself never to display, not in a boardroom, not with reporters, and certainly not with a mid-level manager whose file she had barely glanced at. She had learned that lesson the hard way, in her first year running the company, when a competitor sensed uncertainty in her voice during a single press conference and used it to poach 2 of her biggest clients within a month. She had promised herself it would never happen again, and for 5 years it never had, which was precisely why she trusted her own judgment so completely that afternoon, and precisely why she never thought to ask a second question about the man standing quietly on the 17th floor. At 11:47 that morning, an internal message went out to the entire operations department ordering everyone to gather in the main lobby immediately. Xavier read the notice, glanced at his watch, and then quietly took it off his wrist and set it on his desk. A coworker leaned over and asked if something was wrong. "I think they're about to fire me," Xavier said calmly. "Aren't you worried?" the coworker asked. Xavier looked toward the elevators for a long moment before answering. "No," he said, and then paused. "I'm only worried about them." 300 employees gathered in the lobby that afternoon, murmuring among themselves, as Catherine Sterling appeared on the second-floor balcony with Carter standing at her right shoulder. Xavier was called to the front of the crowd and nobody understood why. "Sterling Dynamics has very clear standards when it comes to loyalty," Catherine announced into the microphone, her voice carrying across the silent room. Xavier looked up at her without any expression on his face at all. She went on to claim that he had repeatedly overstepped his authority, accessed restricted data without permission, and put the company's operations at serious risk, and a wave of whispers spread through the crowd as several employees turned to look at Xavier with sudden suspicion. Some of the younger employees exchanged uneasy glances, because whatever Xavier Cole had supposedly done, none of it matched the quiet, unremarkable man they saw every morning drinking his coffee alone at the same corner table. A woman from the finance team leaned toward her colleague and whispered that this did not feel right, that the accusations sounded rehearsed, like lines read off a script rather than facts pulled from a real investigation, but nobody dared say it out loud in front of Catherine Sterling. Effective immediately, Catherine concluded Xavier Cole's employment with this company is terminated. The room fell completely silent. "What is the official reason?" Xavier asked. "I just gave it to you," Catherine replied. "No," he said quietly. "You read a list of accusations. I asked for a reason." Something shifted in the air because no employee had ever spoken to Catherine Sterling that way in her entire career. Carter stepped forward and warned him not to make this any uglier than it already was. But when Xavier turned to face him, something in his eyes made Carter unconsciously take a half-step backward. Xavier looked back up at Catherine one final time. "Did you personally verify those documents yourself?" he asked. "My decisions do not require your approval," she snapped, feeling challenged in a way she had never experienced from a subordinate. "Understood," Xavier said, and that was all. He did not argue, did not beg, and did not threaten her. He simply unclipped his badge, placed it on the table in front of him, and looked at her one last time. "Miss Sterling," he said. What she asked. "I hope you have someone capable enough to handle what happens at 4 o'clock this afternoon." "Are you threatening me?" Catherine asked, her voice tightening. "No," Xavier said, already turning to walk away. "I'm warning you." 2 security guards stepped forward to escort him out, but Xavier simply looked at them and said there was no need, and strangely enough, both men stopped in their tracks. He walked alone through the crowd of 300 employees past the glass doors, and down the front steps of the building, while Catherine stood watching from inside, frozen in place. Carter leaned close to her and murmured that it was over, but Catherine did not answer him, because outside on the sidewalk, Xavier had just pulled the old black phone from his pocket and pressed the single white circle glowing on a screen. The phone buzzed once and a message appeared. Blackridge protocol reactivated. Xavier let out a slow breath. 12 years, he murmured to himself. Somewhere down the street, the low hum of an engine began to grow louder, and then a second engine joined it, and a third and a fourth. Employees still gathered near the windows began turning to look outside as 10 black SUVs rolled in perfect formation straight toward the entrance of Sterling Dynamics, and every single one of them came to a stop directly in front of Xavier Cole. The doors of all 10 vehicles opened almost simultaneously, and 20 men in dark suits stepped out onto the pavement with no confusion, no chatter, and no wasted movement at all. Sterling's own security team stiffened immediately at the sight of such precise coordination. The men formed 2 lines facing each other with Xavier standing quietly in the middle. Carter's face drained of color as he shouted for someone to call the police, but Catherine raised her hand and told everyone to wait because the door of the 5th vehicle had just opened and Eleanor Grant stepped out onto the street. Catherine recognized her instantly. Eleanor Grant was the chairwoman of Blackridge Strategic Group, a private organization that almost never appeared in the press yet had quietly advised governments, international banks, and dozens of Fortune 100 companies over the decades. Catherine herself had once spent 6 months trying to arrange a single meeting with Eleanor, only to be turned away without explanation. Now Eleanor walked directly past her straight toward Xavier and stopped in front of him before lowering her head in a formal bow. "Commander Cole," she said, "we have been waiting 12 years for this." The entire lobby went dead silent. Xavier glanced at the 10 parked vehicles. "A bit much," he said. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You once told us that if you ever reactivated the Blackridge protocol, we were to come immediately." "That did not require 10 cars," he said. "It did this time," she answered, glancing back toward the Sterling Dynamics tower behind them. Catherine finally stepped outside and approached the pair, addressing Eleanor by name. "Who is Xavier Cole?" she demanded. "You just fired him." Eleanor replied simply. "I know that," Catherine said. "Then you already have your answer," Eleanor told her. Catherine's patience snapped. "I want to know what he used to do," she insisted. Eleanor turned to Xavier, who shook his head once. "Not necessary," he said quietly, already opening the door of the waiting vehicle. Before stepping inside, he looked back at Catherine one final time. "You have 4 hours," he told her. For what she asked. He said nothing, and the door closed behind him as all 10 SUVs pulled away in formation, leaving Catherine standing motionless on the sidewalk. Carter muttered that it was all just a performance, but Catherine turned on him sharply and ordered every scrap of Xavier Cole's employment history placed on her desk within 10 minutes. 15 minutes later, the head of cybersecurity walked into her office, his face pale as chalk, and set a single folder down in front of her. "We found his file," he said. And Catherine asked. The cover page held only 4 words printed in bold red letters. "Federal Access Restricted Level 7. The man swallowed hard before speaking again. "Miss Sterling," he said, "we don't have clearance to open this." Through the investigation Catherine ordered, and the reluctant story Eleanor eventually told the truth about Xavier Cole slowly came into focus. 19 years earlier, Xavier had not been a soldier or a federal agent of any kind. He was a specialist in logistics and crisis management, and his gift was almost supernatural, the ability to see a collapse coming long before anyone else noticed the first crack. During a banking crisis in New York, Xavier spotted an abnormal flow of money 11 hours before the payment systems came under attack, and his intervention helped isolate $14 billion in assets before the damage could spread. During a supply chain crisis in Eastern Europe, he personally coordinated 600 vehicles across 4 national borders in 36 hours, without a single worker losing their life. During the kidnapping of 3 corporate executives in South America, Xavier designed the entire evacuation network from scratch. And the press never learned his name. but the most powerful chief executives in the world knew it well. Xavier never traveled with bodyguards, because the people who needed bodyguards were usually the ones calling him in the first place. There was a private joke inside Blackridge, one that Eleanor repeated to Catherine with something close to reverence, that Xavier Cole did not solve crises so much as he simply refused to let them finish, arriving in the middle of collapse, and quietly rearranging the pieces until the disaster ran out of momentum on its own. Diplomats had once called him in the middle of the night, when a currency collapse threatened to topple a small nation's economy within hours, and Xavier had spent 11 straight hours on the phone coordinating 3 central banks, before anyone in that government even finished reading his first briefing. He was never interested in credit, never interested in headlines, and never once allowed his name to appear in a single official report. The entire coordination system that Blackridge Strategic Group was built around had been designed by Xavier himself, a framework known only as the Blackridge Protocol, and the single person with the highest authority to activate it was Xavier Cole. Why did he disappear? Catherine asked Eleanor, who fell silent for a long moment before answering. 12 years earlier, Xavier's wife had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and doctors gave her only 18 months to live. Xavier faced a choice between continuing to run billion-dollar crisis operations across the globe or going home to be with his family, and he resigned in a single night, without hesitation. He spent the final 2 years of his wife's life caring for her personally, and after she passed away, he raised their daughter entirely on his own, walking away from private jets, from power, and from tens of millions of dollars in bonus payments he refused to accept. He wanted only to live as an ordinary man. Eleanor then revealed something that made Catherine go completely still. "He came to Sterling because of your father," she said. 13 years earlier, Catherine's father had personally met with Xavier and learned that Sterling Dynamics carried a serious hidden weakness deep inside its operational systems. Before he died, he quietly asked Xavier for one favor: to watch over the company if it ever fell into real danger. Xavier had never taken the job at Sterling to earn a paycheck. He had taken it to keep a promise made to a dying man. Catherine sat in silence, understanding for the first time that the man she had humiliated in front of 300 employees had spent years quietly protecting her father's company without asking for a single word of recognition. Her phone rang before she could process the thought any further, and her chief financial officer's voice came through in a panic. 17 containers worth $240 million had just vanished from Sterling's tracking system entirely. At the same moment, 3 separate banks froze the company's lines of credit, and the stock price began its first plunge of the day. Catherine glanced at the clock. It read 3:59. Xavier had warned her exactly what time this would happen, and the clock had just struck 4. At 4:03, Sterling's entire international shipping system locked down completely. At 4:07, a partner in Singapore canceled a contract worth $1.2 billion without explanation. At 4:11, rumors that Sterling had violated export control regulations began circulating across financial news outlets. At 4:16, the stock dropped 14% in a matter of minutes. Catherine called an emergency meeting, and 20 executives filled the war room within minutes. But not one of them had a single answer for what was happening or how to stop it. Reporters were already calling the front desk asking for comment on the sudden drop, and somewhere in the building, a junior analyst had already leaked the internal panic to a financial blog under a fake name, which only made the stock fall faster once the story spread. Outside the building camera, crews began setting up on the sidewalk, and by the time the evening news cycle began, the phrase "Sterling Dynamics" was trending across every major financial network in the country, each anchor speculating about fraud, mismanagement, and a young chief executive who might be in over her head for the very first time in her career. Catherine watched the numbers tick downward on the main screen in the war room, each red digit landing like a small blow, and for the first time in her career as chief executive, she understood what it felt like to watch something she had built slip out of her hands in real time. "Who controls the Savannah shipping route?" Catherine demanded, and silence answered her until someone finally admitted the truth. Xavier Cole had. "Who has replaced him?" she asked next. No one had. Carter interjected quickly that they did not need Cole at all, but Catherine was already beginning to see him differently. She ordered the legal team to pull the 3 violation reports used to justify Xavier's termination. And within the hour, they discovered the electronic signatures had been copied. The internal complaints had come from accounts belonging to employees who no longer worked at the company, and the data access flagged as unauthorized had actually been automatically granted by the system itself. The entire termination file had been fabricated from beginning to end. Catherine locked the conference room door and stared directly at Carter. "Did you create that file?" she asked. He smiled coldly. "You signed it," he said. The words hit her like ice water, and for a moment, she said nothing at all, simply staring at the man she had trusted for 6 years, the man who had sat beside her in every major decision since she took over the company from her father. She thought back to every quiet suggestion Carter had ever made, every time he had steered a conversation gently in one direction or another, and she realized with a growing sense of horror that she had never once questioned him the way she questioned everyone else. He had built himself into her blind spot slowly, patiently over years, until she trusted his judgment almost as much as her own, and that trust was exactly what he had spent all of it to buy. Carter admitted almost proudly that he had quietly rerouted the 17 containers himself, but that was only a fraction of what he had done. He had sold Sterling's entire supply chain data to an investment fund that was betting billions of dollars on the company's stock collapsing. And when Xavier discovered the trail leading back to him, Carter had needed him gone, immediately whatever the cost. Catherine ordered security to detain him on the spot, but Carter had already prepared for exactly this moment. The building's entire door control system locked down, and the power on the 61st floor cut out completely. By the time the backup generators kicked back on, Carter had vanished. Catherine ran to the window in time to see a helicopter lifting off from the roof of the building across the street, carrying him away into the night. Her chief financial officer warned that if the markets opened the next morning with the company still in this state, Sterling could lose control of itself entirely. "What options do we have left?" Catherine asked, and no one in the room said a word until Eleanor finally spoke. "There is one man," she said, and Catherine already knew exactly who she meant. She called Xavier once. No answer. She called 5 times. Still, nothing. She called 12 times, and the silence on the other end never broke. "Where is he?" Catherine asked Eleanor. "Blackridge," Eleanor answered. "I'll go there myself," Catherine said, already reaching for her coat, but Eleanor shook her head slowly. "You don't understand," she said. "Xavier no longer works for you." Catherine arrived at the Blackridge compound just outside Chicago at 9 o'clock that night, and it was nothing like a corporate skyscraper. It was a quiet, guarded complex hidden from public view, and the woman who could call a governor on a moment's notice found herself stopped cold at the front gate. "You don't have an appointment," the security guard told her flatly. "I'm Catherine Sterling," she said. "I know," he replied. "My company is in the middle of a crisis," she said. "I know," he repeated. "I need to see Xavier Cole," she insisted. "Mr. Cole does not wish to see you," the guard answered, without a hint of hesitation, and for the first time in years, Catherine Sterling was forced to wait. An hour passed. Then 2. Catherine sat on a hard metal bench inside a small waiting room, something she had not done in longer than she could remember, watching her phone light up over and over, with messages from panicked executives, none of which she answered. She thought about her father, about the quiet man he had once trusted with the company's darkest secret, and about how strange it felt to be the one now begging for an audience instead of granting one. At 11:17, the door finally opened, and Xavier stepped outside wearing no suit and no entourage, just himself. Catherine rose to her feet immediately. "I need you," she said. "No," he answered. "I can pay you any amount you name," she said. "That's exactly why you don't understand," he replied. Catherine began listing everything at stake: the $18 billion company, the 32,000 employees, the thousands of families depending on every paycheck. But Xavier only listened in silence until she finished, then asked a single quiet question. "Did you come here for the company, or because you're afraid of losing your throne?" The question landed harder than she expected, and Catherine had no answer ready. Xavier turned to leave, but she stopped him with 3 words. "I was wrong," she said. He paused. "I never checked the file myself," she admitted. He stayed silent. I let my own arrogance make the decision for me, she continued, her voice lower now than he had ever heard it. I'm not here asking you to save me, she said. I'm asking you to save 32,000 people who had nothing to do with my mistake. Xavier turned back around and for the first time looked at her not as a billionaire but as the daughter of the man who had once asked him to protect Sterling with his life. Where is Carter now? Xavier asked. We don't know, Catherine admitted. He turned to Eleanor. Get me the map, he said, and Eleanor smiled quietly because the quiet commander had just returned. Xavier reviewed Carter's flight data in under 40 seconds and pointed to a single spot on the map without hesitation. Carter isn't running, he said. Then what is he doing? Catherine asked. He's coming back, Xavier answered. To do what she pressed. He looked up at her. To finish taking your company before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. At 11:42 that night, Xavier walked into the Black Ridge Command Center, a vast room that lit up the instant he crossed the threshold, 10 primary screens glowing to life, and 40 specialists already at their stations. He stood in the center of the room, and no one needed an introduction. Eleanor said only 2 words. Commander on floor. The entire room fell into absolute silence, and Xavier began issuing orders without a single wasted breath, sending one team to trace the missing containers, another, to examine suspicious short-sell transactions, a third, to contact the banks directly, and a fourth to verify Sterling's own servers from the inside. Xavier quickly discovered that Carter had not acted alone. 3 members of Sterling's own board of directors were involved, and the plan was disturbingly simple. Manufacture a legal crisis crash. The stock price forced the banks to cut off credit, and then call an emergency board meeting at 8 the next morning to remove Catherine entirely, and sell Sterling to the investment fund, secretly backing Carter's scheme. Xavier checked the time. They had 8 hours. He divided the work the way he always had, breaking an impossible 8-hour deadline into smaller windows. He could actually control 30 minutes to trace the money, 90 minutes. To corroborate it against banking records, 2 hours to build a case airtight enough that no lawyer in the country could pick it apart, and the rest of the time held in reserve for whatever went wrong along the way, because something always went wrong along the way. Eleanor watched him work from across the room, remembering a younger version of this same man who once slept only 4 hours a night for 11 straight days during a crisis in the Pacific. Never once raising his voice, never once losing the calm, steady focus that had made him legendary among people who had seen far worse things than a corporate takeover. She had told newer recruits about him for years without ever using his real name, calling him only the man who never panics, and now, watching him stand in the same room again, after 12 years away, she understood why the legend had never faded. It was the same method he had used years earlier to hold together a collapsing supply line during a war zone evacuation, and it was the same method he had used to keep his own small household running during the darkest 18 months of his life, breaking an unbearable problem into pieces small, enough for one man to carry. Catherine watched him work, stunned that the same man who had once sat quietly on the 17th floor fixing spreadsheets was now coordinating international lawyers, financial forensics experts, and former intelligence officers, without a single person questioning his authority or asking him to repeat himself twice. At 2:13 in the morning, Black Ridge located the missing containers still on American soil, their tracking codes deliberately falsified. At 2:46, Xavier found the financial trail directly linking Carter to the investment fund. By 3:22, they hit a wall. The evidence was still not strong enough to stop the board's morning vote. "Is this over?" Catherine asked quietly. "Not yet," Xavier said, glancing at his old watch before dialing a number from memory. "Cole," a voice on the other end answered. "I need to collect an old debt," Xavier said simply. 30 minutes later, an audit file arrived from Zurich proving that Carter had funneled $84 million through a shell company over the past 2 years, but Xavier still was not finished. He wanted Carter to walk directly into the trap himself, so he sent out a deliberately false message announcing that Black Ridge had failed to recover Sterling's stolen data. Catherine looked at him in disbelief. "You want him to think we lost?" she asked. "I do," he said. "Why?" she pressed. Xavier answered calmly. "Greedy men always want to witness their victory in person." At 7:41 that morning, a black sedan pulled into the parking garage beneath Sterling Dynamics, and Carter stepped out with a satisfied smile on his face, completely unaware that 46 separate cameras were already tracking his every move. Xavier watched the feed roll in on the main screen. "Got him," he said quietly. At 8 o'clock sharp, Sterling's board of directors convened for an emergency meeting with Catherine seated at the head of the table. Carter walked in, and a wave of shock rippled around the room. He immediately declared that Catherine's reckless mistakes had plunged the company into crisis and moved to remove her from her position as chief executive on the spot. 3 board members raised their hands in support without hesitation. Catherine did not flinch. Carter smirked at her. "Looks like you're out of options," he said. "Are you sure about that?" she asked. At that moment, the conference room door opened, and Xavier walked in alone. Carter's face went white. "You don't work here anymore," he snapped. "That's true," Xavier agreed. "So get out," Carter demanded. Xavier set a folder on the table instead. "No," he said. The screen behind him lit up displaying $84 million, 11 shell companies, 17 containers, and 3 names belonging to members of the very board sitting in that room. The full network of Carter's scheme unfolded on the wall for everyone to see. Carter tried desperately to deny it until Xavier played a recorded phone call that confirmed every detail. Carter turned toward Catherine in disbelief. "You recorded me," he demanded. "I didn't," she said. "You recorded yourself," Xavier told him. Carter did not understand, so Xavier explained that Carter's own company phone automatically backed up every conference call under a policy he himself had approved 2 years earlier. The very system Carter believed he controlled completely had been the thing that finally exposed him. One of the 3 board members tried to interrupt, insisting that none of this had anything to do with him personally, but Xavier simply turned the screen toward him and let a second document speak for itself, a wire transfer dated 4 months earlier carrying his own signature at the bottom. The man stopped talking immediately and sank back into his chair, his face suddenly the color of old paper. Catherine watched the entire performance unfold and realized she was witnessing something she would never have been capable of doing herself. Not because she lacked intelligence, but because she had never learned patience, the specific kind of patience required to let a guilty man talk himself into a corner instead of cornering him by force. Carter lunged toward the exit, but the door opened before he reached it, and 2 federal investigators were already standing on the other side waiting for him. He was taken away in handcuffs within minutes, and the 3 board members involved were suspended immediately, the removal vote canceled before it ever began. But Catherine had not won yet, and Xavier knew it. "There's still one more problem," he told her. "Sterling's stock could still collapse the second markets opened for the day. How much time do we have?" Catha? Blackridge immediately sent verified evidence to the banks, to Sterling's partners, and to federal regulators all at once. The containers were confirmed safe. Credit lines were reopened within minutes. The partner in Singapore suspended their cancellation entirely. At 8:29, 1 minute before the opening bell, Sterling released an official statement to the public. Inside the war room, nobody spoke as the countdown reached 0, and the first trades began appearing on the board. Every executive who had sat in stunned silence 12 hours earlier now leaned forward, watching numbers instead of watching each other. And for the first time, since the crisis began, the room felt less like a battlefield and more like a group of people simply doing their jobs again. By 9:15, the stock had dropped only 4%. By 10, it had already begun to recover. By noon, it was up 3%. Sterling had survived, and somewhere in that quiet, exhausted room, several executives finally allowed themselves to breathe. Catherine stood at her office window, staring down at the street below, and quietly asked Xavier what he wanted in return for everything he had done. "Nothing," he said. "I could give you a seat on the board," she offered. "No," he said. "Chief Operating Officer," she tried. "No," he repeated. "How much money?" she finally asked. Xavier looked at her directly. "Catherine," he said, using her first name for the very first time. "You still don't understand." 1 week later, 300 employees were called back into the exact same lobby where Xavier had been fired. Catherine stood on the balcony above them, but this time she was not holding a script prepared by her communications team. She spoke the truth instead, admitting openly that she had fired a man without ever checking the evidence against him, and that her own arrogance had nearly cost 32,000 people their jobs. Then she walked down the stairs herself and crossed the entire lobby floor to stand directly in front of Xavier. In front of every employee watching, Catherine placed his old badge on the table between them. "I'm not asking you to come back as a senior operations manager," she said, and a soft ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. "I'm asking you to help me build a company that never repeats my mistake again," she continued. Somewhere in the crowd, the same woman from finance who had whispered her doubts a week earlier now stood watching with tears in her eyes, and she was not the only one. Several employees who had once mocked the old Ford in the parking lot found themselves unable to look directly at Xavier, ashamed of how easily they had believed a story with no real evidence behind it, simply because a powerful voice had told them to. Xavier noticed none of this outwardly, though something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what was happening in that room, far better than anyone realized. Xavier looked down at the badge. "What title?" he asked. "You choose," Catherine told him. He said nothing for a long moment, then slid the badge back toward her. "No title necessary," he said. He turned to walk away, but stopped after a few steps. "Monday," he said. Catherine looked up. "What about it?" she asked. "I start at 6 in the morning," he answered. "Office on 61, she offered. He shook his head. 17, he said. "Why?" she asked. Xavier glanced around at the employees still standing nearby. "Because the real problems inside a company are rarely found at the top floor," he said. The following Monday morning at 6:12, the old 2008 Ford pulled into the Sterling Dynamics parking lot exactly as it always had, except this time nobody laughed. Xavier walked through the lobby, and the security guard straightened his posture instantly. Managers fell quiet as he passed. He pressed the elevator button for the 17th floor, and just as the doors began to close, Catherine ran across the lobby, calling out for him to hold it. He held the door, and the billionaire stepped inside with no assistant and no bodyguards trailing behind her. Something about the quiet hum of the elevator reminded Catherine of the sidewalk outside the building. A week earlier, the roar of 10 engines arriving all at once, and the strange calm on Xavier's face as he watched them pull up like it, was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Did you really need 10 SUVs that day?" she asked him as the doors slid shut. A faint smile crossed his face. "No," he admitted. "Then why did they send 10? She asked. "Eleanor likes making an entrance," Xavier said. Catherine laughed genuinely for the first time in longer than she could remember, and the elevator began its slow climb upward. Outside, 10 black SUVs drove quietly past Sterling Dynamics without stopping because the quiet commander no longer needed them. He had already returned to exactly where he wanted to be, not on a throne and not in front of a camera, but in the one place where a small problem could still be caught before an entire empire came crashing down.